And we're back. So, what I want to point out also when we're looking at these classic genetics for Mendelian rules, and interesting to note also about the alleles as they're passed on from one to the next. So, just kind of breaking down what's going on here in this top part. So, each parent contributes one allele to the offspring. So, this parent up here, the white parent in generation number 1 is going to contribute one white allele to each of its offspring. So you can see that in generation 2, each offspring has one white allele. Same for the red one, each one has been passed on to its offspring, so you can see that each of the generation 2 one has received one of these red alleles from each parent. Now when we look at it going from generation 2 to generation 3, this is coming from a cross of those two of the members of generation number 2. And so what you see then is that in the top row here, each allele from the parent generation has an equal chance of being passed on to its offspring. So with two alleles, you have a 50-50 chance of either allele being passed on to the next generation. And so you see in the top row, this is having one parent that has the red and the white trait. On the side row, then this shows red and white trait. And then when you get in the middle is when those two are crossed. So when you have two of the red alleles crossed together, you're going to have what we would call a homozygous individual because it has two of the same alleles. So in this case, this fella has both the red dominant alleles. These two here, so the top right and the bottom left, these ones have received a red allele and a white allele. Now, since red is dominant, they're both going to express the dominant trait. They are be considered heterozygous. And so they would also have the same genotype then as their parents did. They have one red and one white. This one at the bottom right receives one white from dad and one white from mom. So because he only has white alleles, he is going to express the white trait. And so we are just seeing this situation where we have four offspring. But if what Mendel did to come up with these rules is that he would do these crosses, and so pea plants, they would produce like thousands of seeds, and he would calculate up how many of those offspring had these traits. And so what he was consistently finding was that the dominant traits, when you have this cross between two heterozygous parents, you're going to have a 3-to-1 ratio of the dominant trait being expressed and the the recessive trait being expressed. So what makes this interesting is that as he started following these different rules and stuff, trying to figure out is that each allele has a 50-50 chance of being passed on to the next generation. And so there are these certain patterns. That's what explains like these certain patterns. And these certain patterns are going to be consistent is that like each of these alleles has like an equal chance of being passed on to the offspring. And then depending on what alleles those parents had is going to determine the makeup of the offspring. So that's the big thing I want to point out. So in this situation, you have, I guess if you want to look at all the different possible outcomes you could have. So when I have a heterozygous cross between a heterozygous parent for red and white and a heterozygous parent for red and white, I have a 75% chance of my offspring having the red trait expressed. I have 25% chance of that recessive trait being expressed. And then if we look at the homozygotes, so we have 25% chance or 1 out of 4 chance of the offspring being homozygous for the dominant trait. So when I have a red and a red allele being given, I have a 50% chance of the offspring being heterozygous. So they get a red one from mom or a red one from dad and a white one from mom or dad. That's how I get these two here. And then a 25% chance of them being homozygous but for the recessive trait. And so sometimes we're going to have slightly different situations. So say if you get a 50-50 mix where I have 50% of my offspring having the red trait and 50% of them having the opposite trait. This could be from having the one of the parents being the homozygous recessive, so a white parent, being paired with a heterozygous individual that has the red and white trait. So because the parent who has the homozygous recessive is only going to be able to give a recessive allele, the parent that's heterozygous is going to determine what happens. This is often what we see in determination of gender. So, for example, in mammals and a lot of other animals, the heterozygous parent is the male. The male has an X and a Y chromosome. The female is homozygous in that they have two X chromosomes. So that's why you get a 50-50 split roughly between being male or female, because the male parent is the one whose gametes determine the offspring. If you get an X chromosome from dad, you're going to be a female. If you get a Y chromosome from dad, you're going to be male. Moms are only giving X chromosomes, and so even though like each of those X chromosomes has a 50-50 chance of being passed on, the only option that the offspring has is that they're going to get an X chromosome from mom, and so that 50-50 split comes from dad. You have a 50% chance of getting a Y chromosome or a 50% chance of getting an X chromosome. And so these rules that Mendel found explained a lot of the traits and the rules that we were seeing, especially for genes that follow this classical genetics pattern that we're seeing here. There are slightly different options that you could have. So another one that's interesting is we have these X-linked genetics. So where the gene is found on the X chromosome, we find slightly different patterns. So some genes or alleles are only contained on the X chromosome. And so this changes the inheritance pattern. And so if mom is the carrier, this means that unless dad is a carrier for it, it's likely that we're going to see. So let's look at this situation here. So dad in this situation has a normal X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Mom is a carrier for it, meaning that she has the trait, but it's recessive. I have a dominant X chromosome over here that is going to mask the effect of that recessive allele. So this is what happens when mom and dad cross. So again, we have a 50-50% chance of the children getting that allele for either parent. So we have four possible options here. So if this girl here gets an X chromosome from dad, an X chromosome from mom, that's normal, so we get a normal kid. This son here gets a Y chromosome from dad, but he gets a normal X chromosome from mom, so he doesn't express the trait. Then we have the carrier daughter here. So what happens is she gets a normal X chromosome from dad, so she's not going to show the effect, but she gets the recessive X from mom. So she's a carrier. She doesn't express it, but she's considered a carrier. She could pass on the trait to her offspring. Now, look at how it happens here with this kid. So boys are more likely to carry the affected trait because of their Y chromosome. So because if you look at a picture of a Y chromosome is just like this little dinky piece of a chromosome compared to the X chromosome. So often if there's an X-linked gene, it's not going to be masked by the Y chromosome, because the Y chromosome is this little itty bitty thing that's not going to mask the effect. So because there's no X chromosome that this boy has to mask the effect of this X recessive, the son is going to present or manifest the effects of the illness. It is possible for girls to get it, but it's only if perhaps you have a carrier mother who crosses then with an affected son. But because like a lot of these classical illnesses that we followed with X-linked recessive traits, such as hemophilia. So hemophilia was common in these royal families. So again, you tended to have like these royal families that would just kind of marry into other families. So it turns like, you're marrying like first or second cousins often. So we're following, this is King Edward VII and Princess Victoria, not from Princess Victoria from 1786 to 1861, and then Victoria II. So we don't exactly know for sure. We mostly kind of follow this lineage here. This is following the royal family of England. So we get another Victoria and Edward, King George V. This gets us down then to Queen Elizabeth, who's still the queen, and Prince Philip. And so this is like following then Prince Charles, you see Princess Anne, Andrew, and Edward, some of these other folks over here. But what you can see here, so red is the hemophiliac male, meaning that this is the key here. So the male is going to express the traits more likely. It's very rare that a female will carry, because she would have to have both a father who is hemophiliac and a mother who is a carrier. But because hemophiliacs, generally speaking, what that means is that if you are hemophiliac, it means that your blood has a clotting disorder. It makes it very easy for you to bleed out, even from minor cuts, because you're missing a protein, or a protein is not produced as much as supposed to clot your blood cells. So when a hemophiliac gets a cut that for us might be minor, it could potentially be life-threatening for someone from hemophiliac disease. So a lot of these instances, you're going to see these red individuals who are males don't survive or carry on their genes. So, but there's a couple instances where we do get so for example, we got this Leopold dude who did live, I guess, to get married and have children. So what you're going to see often is that like they can kind of trace back and see who is the carrier mother, and this will often show up in her sons and not her daughters, and so that's how we can usually figure out that it's X-linked genetics. And so again, you don't necessarily see like the same patterns you have with a classical Mendelian genetics. This is due to it being on an X-linked chromosome. So for example, in the royal family that we have now with Queen Elizabeth and Prince Albert, their parents did not. So again, they had a dad who had a normal X chromosome and a mom with a normal X chromosome and the X recessive, but dad gave this. So yeah, mom in both these situations gave the good X chromosomes to her offspring, and so we don't see that trait being passed up here, but then you can see it here that like only the males are expressing it, so you can kind of trace back and figure out, okay, so whose mom was a carrier for this disease. So just interesting and a little difference from that and the classical Mendelian genetics. So this kind of ties in with ligers. This is kind of interesting thing about ligers. So ligers are a hybrid, meaning again we have these males and females crossing from the different species, producing these hybrid species. What's interesting about ligers is that males are usually stale, and so this was a rule that's kind of been, or observation that a lot of breeders had for a while. This Haldane guy was a British biologist, I think in the 1800s, and he found that in hybrids, it's usually the heterogametic sex that is sterile or rare. And so, again, thinking back to our mammals, what's usually the heterogametic sex? It's males. Males have an X and a Y chromosome. And so in mammals, this observation holds true for ligers. The male ligers cannot produce sperm, and so they are the sterile ones. But female ligers usually fertile, and there have been some instances where if a male tiger or a male lion is crossed with a female liger, they can produce offspring. But male ligers cannot reproduce, and this is likely due. There's a couple different theories for why this could be, but it seems that when you have these two chromosomes, an X and a Y from different species, they tend to compete with each other, and this is called like this selfish gene or the meiotic drive, and because they are clashing with each other, the sperm tended to like destroy each other. You can look up more about it in this Wikipedia link that I have here. So for your homework, I want you guys to do some work with these Punnett squares. So we saw a simple version. We're looking at the classical Mendelian genetics, I'm going to post a homework assignment for you guys to work on. The same rule, though, applies with dihybrid crosses. This is a cross where I have two traits that I'm looking at, and they follow the same rule as the monohybrid crosses. So each parent has a 50% chance of passing on one of its alleles to the next generation. So for a dihybrid cross, and I'm just going to show you guys a quick example, and I'll post this so you guys can work through it, but you guys got to figure out which gene is which. So in this scenario here, I have round and yellow seeds. I can have round and green seeds. I can have wrinkled yellow seeds, and I can have wrinkled and green peas. So the yellow is the dominant, and the green is recessive in this situation. Wrinkled is recessive, and round is dominant. So when I cross these two, these are both homozygous individuals. When they cross, I get these hybrids, or they're heterozygous for each trait. And so you can see this individual has a red and yellow, the dominant for round and the recessive for round, and the dominant for yellow and the recessive for green. So then I cross these hybrids, and this is the pattern that I get over here. So again, if you look at these crosses, since each allele has a 50-50% chance of being passed over, I have a 1 in 4 chance that I get a round and a yellow allele. Oh no, what happened here? I think I'm being timed out. So anyway, I'm going to post the PowerPoint on the presentation. You can see kind of the pattern stuff that is in there, but each allele has a 50% chance of being passed on to its descendants. And so if you take that into consideration, coming up with the different possible gametes that this parent could produce, that can help you figure out what are the ratios that I should be looking at in this homework assignment. If it helps, if you have questions, let me know. Talk to you guys soon.